This morning, if you were here or if not, we talked about the criminal justice system. We thought this afternoon we would kind of flip this onto the other side of things and talk about some civil remedies for victims of crime. So I thankfully, during the break over lunch after we spoke, I did speak with some wonderful people from the audience who didn't ask questions but during the presentation, but had questions afterwards. If at any point I use any terms or talk about anything that you don't understand, please ask. As a lawyer, sometimes I have a tendency to just talk about things and assume that people understand what I'm saying. So if anybody has a question about any words or terms that I'm using, I would love it if people would ask me questions. And if you weren't here this morning, my name is Renee Franchi. This is Ashley Bortner. Ashley her and I, we worked together at DA's office for several years. Ashley was a victim witness coordinator. I was one of the prosecutors. Since I left the DA's office, I now am a victim civil attorney. I work for a law firm in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We're based in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, but we practice nationally. And 100% of our cases, we represent victims or plaintiffs. And just so a little bit about us, the law firm is Andreozzi Foote. I would say about probably 90% of the cases that we take are, we represent victims of childhood sexual abuse. The other probably 10% or so of our cases, we represent victims of human trafficking, both labor and sex trafficking, victims of other violent crimes. We represent the families of victims of homicide, so we only represent victims. And the type of law firm that we have, we only represent victims on what we call a contingency fee basis, which means in a lot of plaintiffs' cases, we don't get paid unless the client gets paid. So that's a lot of times how it works in the civil side of things with plaintiffs' attorneys. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about civil justice for survivors. I guess I'll first talk about how the civil and the criminal systems are different. They overlap a lot, but they're also vastly different in other ways. There are some common types of civil cases that you would see for victims of crime. And again, I practice in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and we have other attorneys in our office that practice in other states. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today will be Pennsylvania specific, but the concepts, again, will likely be the same or similar enough in other states. So we'll kind of run through some of these topics. Because I am terrible with computers, I have asked that Ashley flip the slides for me, because if I did it, I can't be trusted.
Next slide.
Yes. So there are, I would say, 4 real major things that are different between the criminal system and the civil system. And generally, when you are a plaintiff or a victim, I'll use those terms kind of interchangeably, in a civil case, the civil cases are survivor-centered. So in a criminal case, as we had talked about earlier, and I'll get into it in a little more detail, actually, you know what? I'm just gonna keep talking. Could you go to the next slide? So the first and the biggest difference between the civil and the criminal side is that in the civil case, I represent the victim. The victim is my client, and everything that I do is for the best interest of the victim. In a criminal case, like we had said earlier, the victim is essentially the witness. The state is the client. So that is the big difference that a lot of times people don't understand, nor should they. People wouldn't know this. You assume that if you are going and you're reporting crime, that in the criminal system, you would think, I'm the survivor, I'm the client. You're not. The state is the client, or the Commonwealth is the client. So in civil cases, the client is the victim, and you are my priority. So that is, I would say, the biggest number one difference between the two systems. Next slide. The next big hot topic and how it's different from civil to criminal is that in criminal cases, your restitution or your monetary compensation for being a victim is generally restricted in that you get out-of-pocket costs. Again, we had talked about a little bit this morning about medical bills, if something gets broken, things like that. In civil cases, you can not only recover money for things that are lost, but you can also recover things that are called punitive damages, or basically pain and suffering. You can be compensated for your past pain and suffering. You can be compensated for your future pain and suffering. So you have I would say a lot more of a way to recover a much larger sum of money. And I know it's hard because people say, oh, you sue people in civil court. Well, you only care about money. To which I say, how else are you going to make people feel whole? What else are you going to do? Are you going to take away the pain? Are you going to make them unabused? No. If somebody can tell me a better way to make somebody feel whole than to compensate them monetarily, please tell me. But if there was, there would be another way, but as of right now, there simply isn't. So in the civil system, it is very heavily money focused. Perfect timing. So in the civil system versus the criminal system, the third biggest difference is what we call the burden of proof. So in a criminal case, again, what Ashley had mentioned earlier, the burden of proof at trial is what they call beyond a reasonable doubt, which is not beyond all doubt, but just beyond a reasonable doubt. There's just a little bit, so the burden is that you need to prove up to here and to convince the entire jury of that guilt. In the civil case, at least in Pennsylvania, in most other places, but I'll speak to here, the burden of proof is much lower. It's by preponderance of the evidence, which is you only have to prove it to here as opposed to here. You also don't need to convince the entire jury, only 5/6 of the jury. So the standard of proving your case, I won't say easier, it's never easy, but it takes a lot less evidence to be able to prove it. And the fourth biggest difference is in a criminal case, the focus is on the abuser, the perpetrator, the criminal. The state brings criminal charges against the one person who did the abuse. In the cases that I do, and in civil cases, you can pursue action against not only the perpetrator, but the entire institution or the institutions that allow this abuse to happen. And that is the biggest difference between the two of them. It's like the umbrella. Like the perpetrator is the bottom of the umbrella and the institution is the whole top. So yes, you can have one person who is committing the crime, but that person is committing the crime because this institution is either not following their own policies and procedures to prevent these types of crimes, or they're not following best practices, they're not reporting things when they are mandated to do so, but for these institutions making these acts and decisions, the perpetrator likely wouldn't have perpetrated their crimes against that person. So it's another way of saying, if you have a cut that gets infected, the cut is what is the harm that's done. Well, you can put a Band-Aid on it, but if you have an infection, putting a Band-Aid on it's not going to make the infection go away. You need to treat the whole system, and that's what we can do in civil cases versus criminal cases. Okay. So there are some common types of cases I'm sorry, I keep hitting the microphone. There are some common civil cases for survivors of crimes that I'll talk about. And again, they might be called slightly different things in other places, but this is just kind of the general topics. And again, if anybody has any questions, please, I like when people are engaged and ask questions. But the most common ones that at least I come across are the first two. The first one being negligence, and that would be negligent supervision, negligent screening, negligent hiring, negligent retention of their employees, volunteers, somebody within their organization, inadequate security, things like that. And we'll talk about it a little bit more on the next slide. Also, human trafficking. Human trafficking can be both sex trafficking, labor trafficking. It covers the whole thing. There are some other common ones that we see, like Title IX and Section 1983. I'm not really going to get into that today because I think that in kind of the context of why we're here, I think the negligence and the human trafficking is probably the most relevant. Okay. So some examples to try to put it in context of the types of cases that we handle, or not just us, but other plaintiffs, civil attorneys, to try to explain kind of what I mean by going after the institutions. So for example, we've handled cases against a school district. For example, we can say that, there is a teacher who is sexually abusing one of their students who is a minor, and they are sexually abusing them in the school. You can go after the school if the school didn't perform a background check. Perhaps this individual had a crime against children somewhere else and they hired them and didn't do a background check. Something that they should have known. They could have been fired from their previous job for being inappropriate with a child, and the school district didn't check their references. They can be responsible. For example, the school could have a policy that says, you are not allowed as a teacher to cover up the window of your classroom. Well, this teacher would cover up the window of the classroom and then abuse the child within the classroom. That's a violation of their policy. They can be responsible. So those are some of the things, and there is such a wide variety of ways to hold the school responsible, but that's what I mean when I'm saying that you can hold the institution responsible for a perpetrator's actions. Another one would be you could file a lawsuit against a hotel for profiting from human sex trafficking. So say you have a hotel where they know or should know that you have a pimp who is using a block of hotel rooms to have people come in and out for prostitution. Well, the hotel knows, you see people coming in and out of these rooms all day, and they're profiting from it because they're getting money, they're renting this block of hotel rooms. You can hold the hotel responsible. Another one would be filing against a church for sexual abuse by a religious leader. The church can be responsible if they know or should know that their spiritual leader or their religious leader or somebody within the church is abusing children because they've done it before. They didn't report the abuse. You can hold the church responsible for that abuse. Oh, you already changed it. So another one would be businesses. They profit from labor trafficking. You can hold the business responsible if they're aware that they have people that they're threatening to work for them. They're working under threat, they're not getting paid. The business can be responsible. Foster care agencies. You could have a foster parent or a person within the foster home who is sexually abusing a child, and the foster care agency workers never do house visits. They never ask the child, why do you have bruises? Why did you try to commit suicide? Why did you run away? Things like that. The foster care agencies can be held responsible. Or a nightclub, for example, they have a metal detector, and they're supposed to be, their own policies are to wand people for weapons before they come in. Well, one night they failed to do so, and somebody comes in and shoots one of their patrons. So those are just some of the general examples of different types of cases that you can bring on the civil side of things that aren't just against the perpetrator, but against the broader institutions. Does anybody have any questions? I feel like I'm just talking to a room, people are looking at me, but if anybody has questions, thank you.
When you were talking about the church,
Yes.
like, does it have to be like a brick and mortar church, or or does it have, can it be, say, like a cult, so to speak, like that would, have a leader, but maybe they meet in different locations, like where there's maybe some sex abuse going on and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So
theoretically, yes, it could be. We'll talk about it a little bit later on the issues of being able to actually collect money from those institutions, but it could be anybody functioning as a group. But that's a good question, thank you. So in Pennsylvania, the word negligence, we use the word negligence, and we call that common law. It's not like in the crimes code where if you're going to be guilty of this crime, you have to commit X, Y, and Z elements that are listed in a book that is published, and these are the laws. Negligence is what is called common law. So to prove a negligence case, there's 4 things that need to be proven. 1, duty, that the defendant had a duty of care. So a school has a duty of care to protect the children that are within its walls. Breach of duty, the defendant breaches that duty of care. So that would be that they don't follow their own policies to tell the teacher to take the blocking off the window, and therefore the teacher abuses the child in the classroom. Cause would be the breach of care was the direct cause of the injury. And then damages, that actual damages resulted from this behavior. And just because in a civil case you might not have medical records and say this is how much money I'm owed for my damages, you can still monetize your mental anguish or your pain and suffering. So just because you don't have receipts from a medical facility doesn't mean you can't collect damages. So as it relates to human trafficking, there is a cause of action for people to also bring civil cases for human trafficking. Human trafficking can also be charged criminally, but on the civil side of things, you can do so. The federal law has their own human trafficking laws. Each individual state also likely has their own laws for trafficking. But as it relates to the federal laws, which is what I'll talk about today because it's overarching, an individual who is a victim of human trafficking can bring a civil action against the perpetrator. And a perpetrator in human trafficking is anyone who knowingly benefits either financially or by receiving anything of value from participating in a venture that individual knew engaged or should have known engaged in a violation of the Trafficking Act, which is a big, long way of saying that if you profit from human trafficking, you can be found liable for trafficking that person. And it can be against institutions and not just people. So one thing we'll talk about later that's important to know is the timing of civil cases versus criminal cases. So we can get into that in a little bit, and that's where things can get complicated. So as it relates to human trafficking, and unfortunately, there's different statutes of limitations for pretty much everything. In a trafficking case, adult victims of human trafficking have 10 years to bring a case. Child victims of trafficking have 10 years after they reach the age of 18. So whether or not you were trafficked as a 5-year-old or as a 17-year-old, you have until you turn 28 to bring a case for trafficking. That is a lot of writing. I wasn't going to read all that to you. I'm sure nobody wants to listen to me do that, but this is just to know that forced labor is a form of trafficking. In the media, and in movies, things like that, you always hear about sex trafficking, but people don't really talk about labor trafficking. And labor trafficking is when you're having somebody work and they're working because they're being threatened of bodily injury, threats of physical restraint, threats of harm to themselves or harm to others, threats that they're going to use the legal process against you. So you can't have somebody say, you have to work or I'm gonna call the police and they're gonna make you work. No. Or any pattern that basically convinces or tricks or uses manipulation for people to keep working. So that is what human trafficking is. It is so broad, and I think people don't realize that. And again, I can talk to anybody about this afterwards, but I also put the section numbers up, so if anybody wanted to read about it, you know where to look it up. It's horribly boring, but if anybody wants to read it, that's where you can find it. And sex trafficking is the next subsection, and it's the same thing. It's when you are basically forcing somebody to perform sexual acts and receiving compensation. Now, in a civil case, you have to prove generally 3 things. kind of call it like the 3 legs of the stool. You have to prove each of them, and if you only prove one, your stool's gonna tip over. So first, you have to prove that the actual abuse or the crime happened. The good news is if the perpetrator or the abuser was charged criminally and convicted of that crime or pled guilty of that crime, you can use that conviction to prove that first leg of the stool. If you don't have a conviction, it does not mean you can't go forward in a civil case. It just makes it so that you have to physically go out and prove that first element.
And you can do both.
Yes.
You don't have to choose, I'm gonna go against this person criminally, or I'm going to choose to go the civil route. You can do both things.
Yes, yep. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but if I miss any of that, let me know. The second thing you have to prove is that the institution itself is liable. And that was what we had talked about with the elements of negligence, trafficking, whatever it is that you're bringing this under. And then third, you have to look at the damages. And that would be, pain and suffering, the monetary damages, basically that some harm happened to that victim. And there's a difference with damages between monetary damages and how much it's worth, and ability to actually collect those damages, but we can talk about that in a little bit. So in Pennsylvania, and generally everywhere else, but specifically in Pennsylvania, there are statutes of limitations for sexual abuse for civil cases. It is split between childhood victims and adult victims. And oftentimes, the civil statutes of limitations are different from the criminal statutes of limitations. So if somebody reports a crime, or if you're a victim, or if you work with victims, it is important to make sure that that law enforcement or your attorneys know, so that something can get filed within that time. Because if you miss a statute of limitations, generally your cause of action is gone forever. So in Pennsylvania, the statute of limitations for sexual abuse for civil cases was changed in 2019. So at this time, the time limit for survivors, if you were a child victim, is that you have until age 55 to file a claim. For adults where the abuse happened between the ages of 18 and 24, you have until age 30. And for adults where the abuse happened age 25 and up, you only have 2 years after the abuse occurred. Unfortunately, the 2019 changes are not retroactive. And what that means is if you were a victim before 2019 and you were already past the statute of limitations, you don't get a chance to then rebring claims. You are past the time. So let's see, I think the next one might go, I don't remember. Yes. So in Pennsylvania, there's been talk about, you hear the word like a statute of limitations window. People hear that term thrown around. And what that means is that there is legislation that is pending to open a quote unquote window for a statute of limitations for childhood sexual abuse, which if it gets passed, there was an administrative failure that caused it to not even go through, I believe, last year. But what that will mean, and what many states are doing, it happened in New York, it happened in New Jersey, there are other states that abolished their statute of limitations altogether. But what the plan is to basically open a window saying that for these span of years or for this span of time, even if you were past your statute of limitations, you can still bring a claim. So everybody keep their fingers crossed that it actually happens in Pennsylvania, and then people who are unable to bring claims will be able to. But like I said, there are plenty of states. I believe Maine got rid of their statute of limitations altogether. Some windows closed in other states. Colorado just opened one. So this is where we want to talk a little bit more about mandated reporters. So at least in Pennsylvania, our mandated reporting law is under the Child Protective Services law. And we all in here know that it's enacted to protect children from abuse. Full stop, the end. That is why this law exists. And there is a very wide definition of what child abuse is. Child abuse could be physical abuse, it could be mental abuse, it could be any type of abuse that you would think would fit underneath the definition. It's not just, I was slapped instead of punched, therefore it's not abuse.
And a lot of this, if there's ever any question, if you are a mandated reporter and you have a question about is this or isn't this, even if you're questioning it, you report it.
Yes.
You should report it.
Yes. And abuse can be from either acting or failing to act. So it covers a very, very broad range of conduct. Next slide. Okay. So these are just there's a very long list of who mandated reporters are. And this is just some of the more common ones that we see. And it's important to remember that you only have to have a reasonable cause, reasonable suspicion that there is child abuse happening. You don't have to know for sure that there is child abuse happening. You don't have to witness it yourself. But if, as a mandated reporter, you have a reason to believe that there is abuse that is happening, you are mandated to report that abuse. And some of these people that, don't make me list that off without reading it. So some of the people who are mandated reporters are people who are licensed in a health-related field, like nurses, doctors, school employees, teachers, people who work within an institution are mandated reporters. Employees of child care services, social services, government agencies that work with children. Spiritual leaders. And when I say spiritual leaders, that's actually the way that it's written in the law. So it's not just priests, but not deacons. No, if you are a spiritual leader in a church, you are a mandated reporter of child abuse. And this is, again, it doesn't have to be a building of a church. It could be any religious organization. So if you're a spiritual leader in your, however you describe it, I don't know, a cult of certain religions that doesn't have a freestanding church but acts as an organized religion, mandated reporter. Law enforcement and first responders, foster parents. So it is a very long list of the people who are mandated to report child abuse. And if you're a mandated reporter and you do not report child abuse, it is a crime. So who do I report to? As soon as a mandated reporter becomes aware that there may be child abuse, in Pennsylvania at least, you report it to Childline. I put the number up here in case anybody wanted it, but as I think we had said earlier, for anybody who wasn't in the room, most people aren't walking around with the number for Childline in their pocket. That's just not practical. It's just not the way that life works. So if you aren't able to know that number or remember it off the top of your head, I remember back in the 90s, I actually remembered like my friends' phone numbers, but now I have no idea. I'm not going to remember this number. But if you have a question and you are a mandated reporter and you can't remember, just call 911. You are reporting it. They might give you the number for Childline. They might report it themselves. But saying something is what is needed, and you just can't say nothing.
The other thing that's important, someone asked me a question about this during the break, so I wanted to bring it up. Mandated reporters or reporting child abuse in general, you are kept anonymous. Mm-hmm. Your name will not show up on that report. The people who you're reporting against will not know that you were the one who made that report. Mm-hmm. So that's very important to know.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
I work obviously for Children's Services in Ohio, and
it's the magical microphone.
Yes, I used to always say that to people, and I always have to clarify that. They might know if it comes to court, because you might be subpoenaed. So I always do that little caveat, it might come out at some point that you were the reporter. And so it's not to scare people, it's just to be honest with them. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Thank you. So, again, I can't harp on this enough. It often comes up, the question is asked, does a mandated reporter need to be mandated reporter? I just found my own typo. Does a mandated reporter need to be certain that the child was abused? No. If you suspect that a child is being abused, you must report it. End of story. So if anybody, we can just cover up the typo that at the top, or somebody can like edit it out, so, yeah.
And even if you're receiving that information secondhand, you're not hearing it from the child themselves, that's still a reportable,
Correct.
Offense.
Yes.
Can I just give you an example?
Yes.
And then you tell me, because I've been on the fence about this.
Yes.
There was a couple that came to us, and this guy opened up. He's 40-some years old, and he told us a story about at 6 years old how he started being abused by his stepdad. His mom had him as a little boy before she married. So, and this guy adopted him as his son. At 6 years old, started molesting him. There was no animal on the farm safe from this guy. The boys told us that they were not allowed to have any female dogs around. And then they went on and they said, by the actions of the brothers, they live in Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, down there somewhere. And this happened in Indiana. They said, we're afraid because of some things that it's happening to the grandchildren now by this same guy. So from what I'm understanding, I should be reporting because my husband and I are both mandated reporters.
Yes. I personally would report that. I have had the same situation. I had someone come in for a case. We were sitting in court together. It was a juvenile offender, and the juvenile offender had been molesting her daughter. It was a step-parent relationship. The perpetrator's father has a new girlfriend who also has a daughter. She told me, I've heard that, he's doing the same thing to her. I reported that immediately. I would report that for sure.
I always say err on the
Okay.
side of caution.
Especially when you have someone who is identifiable, so you know that it's the same guy doing the same thing. You might not know the name of the child, but if that is reported to law enforcement, they can look into, what children does he have access to, who could they be talking about.
Well, I know for sure that the son was, up until the time he was dating, it finally stopped when he threw his stepdad down the stairs because he was so sick of it. And there's a granddaughter, these are two that I know of. So, okay, I know what to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, all the mandated reporting laws are slightly different from state to state, but I always say that if you even think that you should report it, report it.
It's always better to have, I would never want that choice to be in my hands. So I always say, you know what, even if I'm not 100% certain that they're going to be able to do anything with this, I'm going to put it off on someone else so that I know that it's off of me and my conscience, and make sure that, it's passed on to the proper people.
Correct. Yes.
So I had a comment and then a question.
Okay.
The comment is just, I was just reminding people that if you're thinking about reporting, to make sure that safety planning happens, especially if it's a situation where maybe it's a nonverbal child, and that the only way anybody could know about the abuse is because of the mother. The person is going to know who talked. So the abusive person could retaliate. And so you want to make a safety plan for that protective mom. And then the other thing is, just in Pennsylvania, would there be children that are maybe have challenges and receive services from Board of Developmental Disability that might also be mandated reports that are like over 21? Do you have that in Pennsylvania? Because like in Ohio, if a child receives services from Board of DD, even if they're 30, you would still have a mandated report.
I believe yes, and I apologize, I'm not prepared for that question, but I would assume yes. But if you would like, or if people are interested, I could always go and look at that in more detail. Yep.
It's a really good question.
Yes.
Yeah.
I went through a situation that looking back, I leaned on good advice, and I'm confident we did the right thing, and yet I still would like to hear a professional perspective from someone in the legal field. So there was a teenager who had committed several crimes, sex crimes against toddlers, and he grew up to be an adult who got involved in foster care. And we found out because he talked about it, and my husband was sure that he had not told foster care. We did report him, much to the chagrin of him and his church leaders, but the state wasn't able to do much because by that point the toddler victims were adults, and so if any charges were going to be pressed, they were going to have to be willing to press those charges, and he still has his foster kids in his home. How could we have made that go better?
Well, first off, I'll say I will definitely give you the validation. You did the right thing. You definitely should tell someone in that situation. I don't know what could be done differently because, like we said earlier, unfortunately, the country we live in, the Constitution protects defendants, and you are innocent until proven guilty. So if charges were never filed, if he was never convicted of a crime, there's not much from a legal perspective.
Yeah, at least for a criminal
Right.
perspective, if it's beyond the time, there isn't much you can do. However, that doesn't mean you can't have civil liability. There are cases you can bring cases against somebody who may have perpetrated abuse against multiple victims and may not have been charged, and you can still bring a civil case when the institution that this person works for should have known. If the foster care agency is aware, theoretically, that this man has perpetrated against other children before, even if there aren't charges against him, if he then abuses a child while a foster parent, they should have known. So there may not be, a way to put him in jail for it, but
Proactively.
and
solve
unfortunately, sometimes it takes the abuser to abuse again to be able to do something about it, which is awful. Unfortunately, there isn't much you can do about it, but if he abused somebody while this person is in the foster, working for the foster system now, theoretically, if they knew or should have known that this man was an abuser, then they can be held liable. So I hope that kind of answers it. And I always hate saying, and I always say this is such a lawyer answer where it's like, well, it depends. It depends. And I hate saying that, but it's true. And just because, one avenue might be closed, you can always try to detour. Try to exhaust all of your options is what I say to people. Just because somebody doesn't get charged criminally doesn't mean you can't pursue them civilly. Or if you are past the time to be able to pursue somebody civilly, it doesn't mean you can't go after them criminally. So there are a lot of different avenues you can take. And unfortunately, just the way the system works, sometimes there isn't anything that can be done, but at least try. Yeah, so I hope that kind of answered it.
We don't have a satisfying answer for that one.
Yeah, if I did, I'd be a wealthy woman.
Actually, I have two. One's a comment, one's a question as well. When you had brought up the money, that some people feel guilty or that money's not going to make a difference, I phrased it to them before that there's a lot of money in churches, especially Amish communities and Mennonite communities are very wealthy. And when the abuse starts costing them more money than they make off of it and hiding it, then they'll start doing something about it. So if nothing else, just that the abuse, they're going to have to pay out millions of dollars, that'll stop it real quick. They'll start reporting.
Yeah, I would point
where it hurts.
I would point your attention towards what's happened in the Catholic Church.
Yes.
So.
And you can donate the money. I mean, you can donate to an organization that advocates,
Exactly.
Against abuse, that type of stuff. You don't necessarily have to keep it. But I always bring that up to people that they, money's not necessarily going to heal anything. But once it starts costing money, then people start paying attention.
Pay it forward. And we've had clients, and I've worked with people who, when they've recovered money, they've donated it. I mean, there are ways to pay it forward. And I always tell people, even if this isn't satisfying for you, or this isn't making you feel like you're made whole, maybe you can help somebody else. And I always say that being able to pursue a civil case and affect changes in policy or change the way institutions do things, you might be able to help save one more person from being abused.
And since civil cases often go against an institution as a whole, they often receive a lot more media coverage, which also
Yes.
not requires, but if you're gonna change, it's because you're getting a whole lot of backlash to, change. So money, also the media coverage is a good reason to pursue a civil case.
Yep.
And somebody who's signed a non-disclosure, are they still able to civically go after an organization or a church?
It depends. It depends on what your non-disclosures say, honestly. It's case-by-case basis, so it's hard to answer that. However, I will let you know that you cannot sign away your legal rights to report crimes, generally speaking. So if you settle with, and again, I'm just going to speak very generally because, I'm just going to speak very generally. If somebody signs an NDA or a non-disclosure agreement with, an institution or someone to settle a case or whoever it may be, to say this is how much money we're going to receive and drop the case, you cannot sign an agreement that says, if I become aware of abuse, I'm not going to report it, or I'm not going to report this abuse to police, as a term of this agreement. So that's one thing that people cannot sign away. So if you ever are involved in a situation where part of the non-disclosure agreement is you will not report to police, it is illegal. And it looks really bad too, so, yeah. And so, yes, sir.
So we got a question from online. One of our live stream viewers is wondering, what if a mandated reporter is a minister of an Amish church and says that reporting is against their religious beliefs?
The law says they have to report, so whether or not it's against their religious beliefs, the law says that they must report it. And that's one thing.
Vaccines.
And that's one thing, that there are some, and this is, I want to make very clear to people, there are some things that we all know that the plain community or certain, thank you, that's a great question. Whoever, I obviously can't see the person, but thank you for relaying the question. That's a great question. There are some things that, yes, certain religious communities don't need to do because of their, their religion. You can say, I don't need to get a vaccine because of my religious beliefs. But when the law says that you are a mandated reporter, your religion can't tell you, oh, you don't have to report because the religion tells you no. No, that is the law. So just because certain religions are exempt from some things, it does not by any means mean that they are exempt from all things.
It doesn't put them above the law.
Right, exactly. I thought I saw somebody might have had a question, but maybe not.
No.
No? Did you? No? Okay. So that was, yes. Oh, good, I'm glad people are asking questions. This makes me very happy. I don't have to stand here and just talk at people.
I know we're talking in the context of sexual abuse, but are mandated reporters also mandated to report any kind of abuse?
Yes, any kind of abuse.
And can I just ask you very quickly, if we're aware that a mother is taking drugs like methamphetamine, is that abuse if there's children in the home?
That is potentially neglect. I mean, yes.
Yeah, and if you, and I'm pulling out a piece of paper actually, because there's a very good resource, at least for Pennsylvania, on the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services website. They have a great PDF file or something that you could print out. I should have brought a whole bunch of them, but it's a really good resource that explains to you like what child abuse is. So theoretically, it could be any act or failure to act to care for the child if it affects their welfare. If this person is taking, some type of drugs like methamphetamines or heroin or something, this child is being neglected, that's child abuse.
If it's, if you have a child that's laying in a diaper for, days at a time, that's definitely a neglect type situation. And like we were talking about with the criminal side, at least, there are so many different charges that, you can make it so specific, like endangering the welfare of a child, or, there are specific child abuse charges. It's very nuanced, but it's also, there's a lot of different acts fall under child abuse.
Yes, and even if they aren't at that time injured, if it creates a reasonable likelihood of injury, then yes. So that's why, again,
Needles laying around, things like that.
that's a great question. So, and that's why, again, I always say, if you have to ask, or if you think, always err on the side of reporting it, because the worst thing that happens is there isn't abuse, and then everybody's okay. Yeah, okay. So I think this is my last one. Did I roll through them all that quickly?
No, you still.
Oh, good. Okay. So red flags. And I feel like I just keep harping on the same things, but it's so important. If a mandated reporter does not report abuse or take steps to handle like the child abuse without reporting it, like CCIs or any of these groups that are put together to handle abuse internally, no, that is illegal. If they suspect child abuse, they must report it. Whether you want it to be handled internally within your community or within your religion is one thing, but if they are saying and taking active steps to cover the abuse up or not report it at all, that is illegal. I don't care what anybody says. If you are a spiritual leader in a church, if you are a mandated reporter in a community, if you are putting together a committee to specifically investigate child abuse and you don't report it to law, I'm not saying report it to elders in the church, I'm saying report it to a mandated reporting agency, report it to law enforcement. If they do not do that, they are violating the law. And there is a lot of spiritual gaslighting, a lot of mental abuse that goes along, not just within the Plain community, but within any type of communities in general. That's just one of the universal truths of any community of people, that they want to handle things their way. But again, you are not above the law, and if you have this group that is in place to look out for and to investigate child abuse, if they are not immediately reporting those suspicions to law enforcement, they're breaking the law.
And another thing we touched on in the criminal side earlier today is that you don't get to, say, oh, well, I told my boss, so, they're gonna report it. No, it's, if you heard it, you're reporting it. If you told your boss, they should be reporting it too, because they heard about it from you.
Yes. And I wish it would have been, yes.
We got another question from online here. Should I report if the 14-year-old neighbor girl has reported already but withdrew the charges under pressure? When I learned to know her, the case was already closed. I have full confidence the abuse continued until she was taken to a juvenile detention center a couple months ago. She adamantly said she would not tell the truth. If I had reported, she would no longer have been able to come to my house, and so she didn't want me to report. What should I do now, having not reported and still not sure what I can or should do? Am I a mandated reporter as a neighbor?
So the relationship is solely that you're their neighbor? You're technically, no, you're not a mandated reporter. That being said, even if this has been charged previously, that's for law enforcement to determine how that was disposed of, or if it ever was disposed of, or if charges were ever even brought. So even if there is some type of knowledge that you have that charges have already been filed, you're still supposed to report as a mandated reporter. Does being a neighbor make you a relationship to someone where you would have to report by law?
Generally
Technically,
speaking,
no.
Should they? In my personal opinion, yes. Yes, and I know it sounds kind of cheesy, but if you see something, say something. Because if one person is being abused, I can almost guarantee that somebody else is being abused. It's very rare that an abuser stops with one person. I mean, unless they're deceased and then they stop, but.
Where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yes, yes. Oh, yes. Got it. I look at the pink shirt, and the pink shirt tells me where to look.
What some of them are doing now is, once they realize that they are mandated reporters and they might get in trouble, is they're minimizing the report. So they know the name of the perpetrator, they know the name of the victim, they know exactly what happened, but they're just reporting it as, within this household, we believe abuse is going on. So that way they can say technically they reported it, but they're withholding a majority of the information, so it's not taken serious. How would that be handled in a gray zone like that?
Sorry, I heard some of it, and then that's why we looked at each other funny, because I couldn't hear exactly what you were saying. So sorry, there's like a weird, some of the questions. That's okay. Why I'm looking at people funny, because there's like a weird echo.
Trying to read lips.
Yeah.
Some of the mandated reporters are now reporting within the religious setting. just so they can check the box that they reported, but they're minimizing it or withholding some of the information. So they may know the name of the perpetrator, the name of the victim, and what actually happened in detail, but they don't report it that way. They just report it as in this household, there's abuse going on, but they leave out all the other details so that way there's no action taken.
The information you have needs to be reported. I mean, they can be, honestly, if you have information, and this is just my opinion, and you can again correct me if I'm wrong, but just I know the way that I would look at it, at least if I was a prosecutor. If a mandated reporter has information to protect a child and they're withholding that information from law enforcement, they're hindering an investigation, and that is absolutely illegal and awful. So yes.
Like I said, I have reported on so much less than knowing any of that. Like, I don't know names. I just like, oh, this happened in Florida in 2003. The defendant was, the neighbor from across the street. I don't even know where the address is because it happened in Florida. I'm still reporting that.
Yeah, and if you're picking and choosing what you're reporting, if you don't report information that will lead to creating a safer environment for the child, you're not reporting. Right. Unless you're reporting all the information, you are not reporting. I think end of story. So thank you. That was a great question.
Okay, this was back to the question from the internet person. I can tell you that I have re-interviewed, survivors.
Yes.
And I mean, it could have been a situation where they just didn't feel safe in that moment, and that's why they recanted, but it sounds like they went to some juvenile facility. So absolutely report it, because now maybe they feel safe and they can, say something. So
the other thing is it likely if they're talking about it with their neighbor when they're at their juvenile facility talking to their counselors there, I'm sure that's going to get reported there too. So you're not going to be the only person that's making that report in the next few months. I promise you that.
Yeah.
I just want to say the facility, I'm going to make assumption here, that they're talking about is not what you're talking about or what you're talking about. It's an unlicensed facility where they're not safe there either, and they're going to be heavily pressured to be quiet. They're given prescription medicine and they're drugged, so that way they just stop talking about the abuse, and then they'll be sent back home once they stop talking about it and they're completely silent. That's what those facilities are used for.
Well,
yeah.
There's so much that goes on that it's just...
I hear what you said on a lot of facilities. I think I know this story, and it would be just your regular conventional juvenile detention center.
Okay.
Not that that's good that she's in a juvenile facility, but I mean, again, it might be a safer place for her to be at this point in time.
Yeah, and everybody has their own personal reasons for why they may recant or they may not report it personally. But that's why mandated reporting laws exist, because sometimes the victim is unable to or unwilling to, or it feels unsafe to report it themselves, which is why if somebody else hears that information, it needs to be said.
Another thing, piggybacking off of what you had said, these, a lot of times, especially in sexual abuse cases, at least from the criminal side, there is no... At least with the police departments that I have personally dealt with, I can't speak for everywhere, they're not going to force you to say, yes, you should file these charges because, this is terrible and this is happening. No, they want to make sure that the victim is okay with speaking about this before they're going to file the charges, because a lot of times these types of cases rely heavily on victim testimony. So if at some point that this has been reported, if it's going to be reported again, they're going to go back in and be re-interviewed, and maybe at this point in time they're more comfortable to speak about it, so the charges can move forward at this point.
And there's oftentimes too, with what I am doing now, where I have people who have called me and I'm the first person that they've told, especially I'll just say, for example, within the Catholic Diocese type cases where statute of limitations windows have opened, and we have people who are in their 70s who are disclosing for the first time. These are people who have waited until their very religious parents have passed away before they ever disclosed abuse, because they don't want to ruin their parents' view of religion. And I feel like so much of this piggybacks off of the last presentation about, gaslighting victims and victim blaming. But, this is somebody who has had to live almost their entire life not telling anybody. And there wasn't a a criminal case. Or sometimes people will call me and say, I just need to tell somebody, but I'm not ready to move forward. I'm never going to say, well, I'm filing the case without you. It's not how it works. The only time where, I might put pressure on somebody is if I say, well, today's the 30th, the statute of limitations closes tomorrow on the 1st, I might pressure you a little bit and say, you either need to file something now or it's lost forever. But generally speaking, if people call and say, I've never told law enforcement, what do I do? I'll tell them, let's get you to talk to the police. Like, go tell them now. It's better late than never, because maybe you could help somebody else. Yeah. So you try not to, I want to work within people's boundaries, and it's very important. Sometimes it'll take clients, 5-10 times of talking to them before they are comfortable with me filing anything. Sometimes they only want it filed under their initials so people don't know, and then a year later they say, you know what, I want my name on this, I want people to know. And it takes time, and it's part of healing. It is a process. And unfortunately, most victims will never feel whole truly again, but it is a process, and we all do our part to do what we can. And the bigger team of people you have around you as a victim, and the more supports you have, and the more people that are educated, and especially within the plain community, the more that you educate people on the outside of what goes on. People don't know. We'll be serious here, and I'm not trying to be facetious. People from the outside look and they say, oh, it's so quaint. They're so nice. These things could never happen. Well, awful things happen everywhere, and there are bad people everywhere, and there are good people everywhere. And if the outside world doesn't know what's going on, then it's harder to help. So I really commend people for coming in here and talking, and people who are within the community, and people who are not in the community, and people who are halfway in the community, that hear everybody's sharing their stories and talking about what can be done, because the more we talk about it, the more people can be helped, and the more people are educated, the more we can help.
One other thing that I want to touch on, because it kind of crosses over into the civil side of things. In my presentation earlier, I think I do see some new faces, so I just wanted to kind of go over it again. There are different types of advocates that can help you through criminal processes, civil processes, community-based organizations like the YWCA or PCAR, which is the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. There's a bunch of different ones. I could go off naming acronyms all day, but they all have civil services to you free of charge. So if you are trying to divorce your abuser, or you're trying to file for child custody, things like that, not so systemic and broad, they do that free of charge a lot of times. So it's really important that you look into those resources, so that you're doing what's best for you, and it's also something that isn't going to cost you any money or be a financial burden to you. So make sure you're always looking into your community groups to see how they are able to help you at a more local civil level.
Yes, absolutely. Did you have a question, or okay?
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about what it takes to prove that child abuse is happening? Is the word of a child enough? I'm not a mandated reporter, but I've worked with children for many years and have reported multiple things. And last year, or during COVID, when everything was shut down, my family and I were some of the only people that had contact with a single mom who had 5 young children. And she was in a really bad situation, and she was homeless, but one of her children was being abused physically. And we made multiple reports, but at the end it was so bad that they made a safety plan and removed him to our home for a week, and he had to go to the hospital for some really suspicious bruising on his head and other parts of his body. But after a week they returned him to the mother, and because she knew it was us, because again during COVID, very limited contact with different people, and so we were the only ones who had seen him with that bruising, she cut us out. And so I feel like it was worse for him than if we had never reported, because now he has nobody looking out for him that I know of. But what would it take to prove that that was happening, when all a mom has to do, or all an abuser has to do, is say it was a sibling or it was an accident? How can you prove that with a young child?
technically speaking, I mean, at least in Pennsylvania, all you need is a victim to say this occurred, and that is enough to prove it. I mean, whether or not a jury believes it is another thing, but theoretically, all you need is one victim to say, yes, this happened to me. Because let's face it, I mean, this isn't CSI. Right. You're not going to have some satellite surveillance of everything that happens and see through walls with, photographic evidence. I mean, that's not real life. And 9 times out of 10, all you have is someone's word, or it gets reported when the bruises are gone. There's no proof. Yep.
So I obviously don't know everything about this specific situation, but I do know that in some child abuse cases, some other evidence that you're able to collect would be if they are able to go in for any type of medical exam, like healed injuries. So say, you broke an arm or a finger or a nose or whatever, they can see that old injury, and that's something that you'd be able to introduce as evidence of, this is a pattern of abuse. But yeah,
And that's why they have forensic interviewers too. I mean, if you have a child that's disclosed abuse and they go in, and I keep pointing at you because I know that just like before I was pointing at the detective, now I'm pointing at you. When you have a forensic interview, that's why they have procedures set up for forensic interviews so that the child's word is enough. And that's why they, if they go in and they do the forensic interview, they do these interviews, they perform them in a certain way where the child comes out and tells you on their own, and that's why they are more inherently reliable, because they're created that way. So there are some systems in place to try to help with those situations where it's just a child. But I've seen that so many times where they go back. But if it's still happening, or you think it's happening, or if a mandated reporter thinks it's still happening, and they should say something, And I'm sorry that you were put in a situation like that, because that's tough.
And my second question is a little bit different on the sexual abuse side of things. Have you seen adult survivors, speaking of statute of limitations, have you seen adult survivors be able to go back and get any kind of civil justice or have somebody convicted for something that happened when they were a child? What kind of evidence could there possibly be after so many years that anything happened besides, again, the word of a survivor?
Right. So we deal with them a lot. Because oftentimes it is, the clients are now adults, and it occurred when they were a child, and they just were too scared to say something, or their parents wouldn't believe them, or, your priest couldn't have done that to you. He's a good man. Well, I'm sorry, he did do it, and he's not a good man. So, so for whatever reason, didn't disclose as a child, they're now coming forward as an adult. Obviously, it would be great if it was like, 30 years ago they got a rape kit and there's DNA. Well, we know that in reality it doesn't happen that way. But some things that are helpful is if they told other people, if there are friends that they told at the time, patterns of behavior, things that, so other than just somebody's word, you can look at patterns. Or I remember that the abuse occurred in his classroom, and I remember that the desk was over here, the wall was this color, things that'll basically make them more credible. Also, treatment records are very helpful. If you disclose to a therapist, or 20 years later even, if you go to your therapist and said, this individual did this to me when I was a child, and there's a record of that, you can use that to, I don't want to say bolster their story, because it's not a story, it's a truth, but to help prove
the credibility of
their credibility of what happened. So there are ways to try to help with that, but it's true, it's tough, because you don't, I wish it was. It would make life so much easier, but.
It definitely does make criminal cases a lot more difficult than it would make a civil case, because we talked about, the burden of proof and things like that. And like Renee said earlier, a victim's word is enough, but that is something that a jury also decides. So you can't, we say it all the time, that you can never, you do not know what 12 random people off the street are going to do or decide in any situation.
This is another kind of random thing that could be helpful, but it's something I've encountered in a case before, where somebody is like an adult client who was then a child victim of abuse said, I remembered that I was abused specifically every Thursday afternoon when the foster father and I were the only ones in the house. Well, then you go back and you interview the other children in the house and they say, oh yeah, the foster mother went to an exercise class every Thursday afternoon. Well, that helps because then you know, oh, the child said that he was alone with the abuser in the house, and then you have somebody else corroborating that story saying, you know, the mother was gone at that time. And so those are the types, like the more information you have, the better. Like I always say, bring it out into the sunlight. The more sunlight that touches it.
And the other thing is that most police departments, when we're talking about a criminal case, will have specific detectives for these types of crimes, for sex cases. So they know what to be asking. They know, you know, the types of questions that need to be asked and answered so that they're able to file charges, so that a jury's able to convict and things like that. So, you know, they have that type of experience and knowledge to be eliciting those questions so that, you know, there is enough evidence.
Yeah.
So this question is probably for Ashley, and it's kind of what you just spoke on. And it is that most police departments do have a detective that is specialized in sexual assault crimes. Correct. Now, I live in a very rural area, and what I did, I was sexually assaulted as a child and also as a teenager, and I did some research, I did my homework, and I figured out in our area who was the sexual assault investigator. I made an appointment with him and I went in because it wasn't an emergency situation. So I just wanted you to maybe address that a little bit, because what I found since my case, I actually volunteer with Victim Services, and I often tell people if it's not an emergency case to really do your research a little bit so that when you do go in to report it, that you're talking to the correct, you know, somebody that has a little bit more training, because sometimes you can go in and talk to a police officer, that does not have very much knowledge about it at all. So would you mind talking about that just a little bit briefly?
So first off, that is showing amazing resiliency on your part. That is extremely brave of you, especially at that age, to be able to, you know, put all of that together and know what you're supposed to do.
Sorry, I was an adult by then.
Okay. Either way.
Thank you. And there was a conviction, so and it was 28 years later, so.
See, it's never too late.
So the one thing that I will say is, in a perfect world, we have people in these positions. We have people who are victims advocates. We have people who are police officers, and they are in this job for all the right reasons. They are full on, you know, believe survivors and things like that. In reality, it doesn't always end up being that way. So I definitely, at least procedurally in our county, in York County, we have a task force to address domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and there are certain protocols that they put in place to try to make sure that you're talking to the right people, this case is going the right way. And everyone should be aware of that. So your plainclothes officer, not your plainclothes, your patrol officer, if you get called out to a domestic violence situation or a sexual assault situation, he might be the one taking the initial report, but then the person who you'll have contact with and investigating the incident would be that detective, that specialized detective. So we have these systems in place, at least in York, and I'm sure other places have these task forces. So hopefully, if you're reporting to anyone, your case is going to get in the right hands. That being said, doing some research is never a bad thing. I always say that, you know, I said it before and I'll say it again, education is super important, and being informed yourself is super important, because, you know, you want to feel like you're doing something in this too, and you want to make sure that you understand what's going on and that you're not just kind of a unwilling participant in this. You want to make sure that your needs and your wishes are being taken into consideration. But to answer your question, hopefully if you would go in and report to any officer, you would be able to get in the right situation. But a quick Google search never helps, or never hurts.
And sometimes, and we all know that, you know, there are some very rural communities where some of the police departments really aren't equipped to deal with these types of situations. And as a victim or as an advocate working with a victim, if you're talking to someone and you feel like they aren't hearing you or they aren't listening, be louder. Tell them again, if you aren't being heard, it is your right as a victim to make sure somebody hears you. You know, and it's intimidating, but, you know, make sure they hear you. And again, you're right. Some police departments don't have that person who is capable of doing it, but they are a police officer and they should be able to get you to the right person. But if not, it needs to be handled.
Yeah.
So
don't be scared to elevate it to the next
run
level.
it up the chain.
As a victim's advocate, I got so many phone calls. I shouldn't say it like that. So bad. I received phone calls where victims would call and say, hey, I reported XYZ to this officer 2 weeks ago and I haven't heard anything about it. What's going on? And then me, as a victim's advocate in the DA's office, I send them a quick email and they're like, oh yeah, that report, I'm working on that, I'll get to it right away. So never hurts to go a few steps above or, you know, go to a different agency, because we all do work closely together, and sometimes officers respond better to, you know, an internal request as opposed to you as an angry victim who just continues calling them. Call other people. Don't just call the police department. Call a prosecutor. Call, you know, the YWCA. Have someone else go in there and, excuse my language, raise hell for you.
Well, and my reason for doing a little bit of research is because my perpetrator was Amish, and I knew I've heard the history. Sometimes Amish get special treatment, and I wanted to make sure that this, report that I make is getting taken seriously, and it did. And unfortunately, I know that sometimes people aren't that forthcoming and raise a little hell and make sure that something gets done. So I just want to make sure everybody does know, there is hope. And even if the cases are old, like you said, sometimes you think there's no evidence, but there might be.
Yes.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
The other thing I would like to add to that is I have had, as an advocate, a lot of positive experiences by letting survivors know that if they want to go directly to law enforcement, they need to either, like Lizzie said, ask for the detective who handles sex abuse or sex assault crimes, or failing that, I tell them, then if they say we don't have a detective for that, then ask who is the best officer or the best deputy who really has a heart and a passion for protecting children and sex assault survivors. And typically that leads to better results than just a cold call.
Yes. Because there are definitely, in working with officers, there are officers that are constantly asking me as an advocate questions and wanting to get to know, what best practices are for dealing with domestic violence cases or sex cases. Or you have people who are kind of gunning for that promotion but haven't gotten there yet. So definitely asking for someone who, this is their passion project would be a good idea.
And I want to make sure that people aren't discouraged by that. If you're dealing with a police department that has 2 police officers and they say, well, we don't have somebody that specializes in that. Well, you know what? I'm telling you anyway because you're a police officer and I'm reporting it. So you can't have that discourage you from, just saying, they're not specialized in rape investigations, so therefore there's nothing that we can do. No, I'm still reporting it. You're still an officer. Do something about it. And if you aren't equipped to deal with it, then somebody else needs to be.
And we're not trying to rag on police here.
No. I mean, we all know
they have a very difficult job and they
Yes.
deal with a lot in a day. So I understand where they're coming from sometimes, but at the same time, they work for you. They're here to keep you safe and protect you. So if you don't feel like you're being heard, it's always okay to go above their heads.
Yes, and that I'm in by no way ragging on police officers. I mean, I could never do their job. There's a reason why I never did that. And we all know their limitations. They're severely underfunded, undertrained, overworked, just like so many other professions. But as a victim, if you're reporting abuse and, there isn't a rape investigator there, it doesn't mean that your investigation can't go anywhere. Use your voice. Make sure somebody hears you. So, yes, thank you.
Do you want me to go to the next slide? There's 2 more slides.
I was just going to say, go back to that quickly. This is an important, and this, again, kind of bounces off of we're going to loop back to the presentation, not hours before this, but the other speaker before us. It is never the child's fault. It is never the child's fault when an adult abuses them. I don't care what anybody says. It is not the child's fault. And there is absolutely no reason whatsoever why a child should be abused, sexually abused, it is never their fault. So if anybody, any mandated reporter, anybody ever blames the victim or blames the child, huge red flag. It is never, ever the child's fault. And I think that I mean, again, in this room, we know that, but you just can't say it enough. So, ooh, yes, big slide. So, so there are obviously challenges in every case, but some of the big challenges in civil cases that we see, a lot of it is timing. We talked about statute of limitations. Obviously, sometimes it is too late to do something. It's never too late to say something, but sometimes it's too late to file a case. Oftentimes, you know, if I have a civil case, to the extent that we're able to allow the criminal case to play out first, we always want it to, but in a perfect world, it can't always. Language barriers are another big problem that we all know about. You know, at least in criminal cases, everybody's entitled to an interpreter. In civil cases, it's a little bit different, but you know, you need to make sure that your clients understand, and whether it's language, like you speak Spanish, I speak English, or maybe you speak English but don't have the proper terms for certain body parts, things like that can be a challenge, and it's certainly things that you need to be able to work with. Underrepresented communities, lack of support systems. I feel like these are all things that we've really touched on. The one big thing, though, that we hear a lot is, your client doesn't look damaged. Well, I'm sorry. I don't like to wave a big flag around saying I'm an abuse victim. So, you know, that's one thing that a lot of, you know, a lot of defense attorneys, you know, the other side, the abusers say, well, this person doesn't look damaged. Well, you can't see somebody's emotions. You can't open their head up and look inside and say, oh, they have a lot of damage. So don't ever let anybody say that, you know, okay, you're an abuse victim, but you don't look like you're damaged or you don't act like you're damaged. That doesn't mean you haven't suffered, and it doesn't mean that you don't have damages. So that's it's a big thing. Just because somebody hasn't, you know, chosen a path in their life afterwards to, you know, to do something good or be a productive member of society doesn't mean that you're any less damaged than somebody else. I don't even remember what my last slide was. Is there anything? Oh, Teresa put that in. Poor Teresa is not here, but yes.
From Mother Teresa.
From Mother Teresa. And I think, is that the last one?
Sources. That's it.
Oh, yes. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, so there we go. If anybody has any other questions, I don't even know what time we have until. Are you kicking us off? Are we good?
We're done.
Okay.
Thank you again.